Okay, I think we'll get started now. So begin. Welcome everyone. We welcome you to the inaugural Wisdom Keepers series, and we will have close to 5,000 people on Zoom today with us, which is very exciting. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Red Sky Performance's home is on the traditional territories of the Anishinabe, Mississaugas, Credit First Nations, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. We recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, and that Tekaronto, where trees are standing in the water, continues to be home to many Indigenous nations today. We work in Dish with One Spoon territory created by a treaty between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee that binds us to share the territory and protect the lands.
Good afternoon.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sandra Laronde, and I'm from the Tepee Anishinaabe Nation in Temagami, Northern Ontario. I grew up in a place of 500 people and 1,600 islands, so more islands than people where I'm from. We have two incredible guests with us today, Senator Murray Sinclair and Lee Maracle. And before we start, I'll just do a very brief introduction of them both. Senator Murray Sinclair is Anishinaabe, and he's a member of the Canadian Senate and a First Nations lawyer who served as a co-chair of the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry in Manitoba and as Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're so pleased to have him with us today. As well, we have the fabulous Lee Maracle, who is solo and Cree, and she's an award-winning poet. And just Google her, there's so many books that she's written. She's a poet, novelist, storyteller, and activist, and an activist particularly pertaining to Indigenous people and issues. She also teaches at the University of Toronto. So before we begin, I would also just like to give credit to this beautiful artwork that you've seen here by Philip Cote, who lives here in Toronto. So we're very interested in this series in delving into the COVID-19 pandemic from an Indigenous perspective and context. What does that mean? What does that look like? So some of the questions that I would just like to sort of throw out to sort of center the conversation a bit more that we're about to embark on so as we know, coronavirus has unleashed a wave of panic across the globe. How do we make sense of this pandemic from an Indigenous perspective, from a human perspective? Why is it happening now? Is COVID-19 a mirror of where we currently are as a community or as a species, or is it a major wake-up call? What is it that sits at the center of Indigenous culture or our stories that can help pull us through and move us forward as people? And maybe just not as people, but as all living things, all living beings. Do we, I guess a question, that I've heard over and over again is, will humans ever learn? And it is a big question. Another question I've heard is, do we think that we will ever be truly interconnected and respected of all living beings once again, and all of our relations being all of our relations? And how do we keep our audacity to hope for a better world in the midst of the pandemic and in the midst of all the tragedy that's happening? And is COVID-19 an opportunity? Is there an opportunity here? Is it a reflection and something and a place to grow from? Is meaningful transformation on the horizon? And is it time to do something different? So I'm really open to this being open, go wherever it wants to go. And these are just some questions that I hear from people, or just to set a little bit of a tone moving forward. So I would really, really love to open this up to you now, Lee, to take it from here and speak whatever you would like to go on this. This is just,
Okay, I want to go a long ways back, actually. This is not the first terrible pandemic to ever affect the world. The last one occurred right after the floods that actually engulfed the whole globe. Every place on Earth has a flood story. And the one that we most talk about, it happened to, somewhere between 10 and 15,000 years ago. Scientists haven't figured out yet, but it also includes the melting of the lower half of the glacier that affected North America. And when it did, it went sideways. And I know when I was in school that we learned that it melted into the Great Lakes, but now science is agreeing with us that the lower half melted sideways, and then the upper half, because the stones were heated by a fireball that went from Toronto to Tawasin, the thicker half came down fairly fast and then gouged out the Great Lakes. But anyway, the story says that, and so I go with that. Science says it's 40,000 years ago. I really don't care how long ago it was. We have been here more than 40,000 years, so it's quite possible. But we say 10 and 15. And at the time, the volcanoes went off in the Pacific, and the Pacific, the old people say, folded in half. I don't know if that's true, but it gouged out the sound where I'm from. I think they call it Puget Sound, but it doesn't matter what the name is. The thing is, it gouged it out and made what the white guys call the deepest sound in the world. They actually had a measuring stick for every sound in the world, but I'll go with that. And from there, sickness occurred. Sickness occurred all over. Some of the people escaped to Asia. You know, they say we are from Asia, but actually our people say no, we went toward Asia during the flood. For sure, the Mongolians speak a language fairly close to Denendeh, and it is Denendeh that live in Alaska that would have crossed over into Asia. I don't know, but you know, that's what the story is, so I'm going with it. But in any case, a lot of illness occurred, and the story goes that the trees were able to walk at the time, and then they agreed to sit still. And all that the illnesses could live inside their root systems. And so now when there's clear cutting, 60 new viruses are let into the atmosphere daily. I'm not saying that story is true. I'm just saying that that's what's happening right now. And some people say COVID is one of them. But the lady who worked with COVID wrote a book recently called, I think it's something like Corruption and Pandemics. And she talks about how they were playing with the virus and it got away on them. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what she's saying. And I think a lot of people actually believe that science has been playing with us. It doesn't matter. The point is that we've got a critical situation. And one of the things that is happening that's, you know, on the positive side is the earth is recovering. And someone told me, and I don't know if this is true or not, they said, well, it's too expensive to fix the problem, so they just shut everything down and they figured out a way to do it. Shut it all down for a year or two and then it'll recover itself. It doesn't matter. The point is that we have to be looking at how we care about each other, how we care about the earth, and how we get the things we need to live. And if you go into any store in North America, 90% of what's there, probably more, is not needed for survival. So this is a big problem. And everybody wants to be alive in the way that North Americans are alive. And if that was possible, we'd need an earth, people say 30 times the size that we currently have. So we cannot sustain the North American lifestyle, that's the point. And spread it around, share it around with the world. So the world has to suffer in order for us to live the way we live. And I think North Americans need to reconsider that. And we need to reconsider what we actually need to survive. I don't know if it helps, but I've decided that I'm going to pare myself down to just the basic necessities. And, you know, I gave up beading. I gave up a lot of art things because I just can't you know, justify sustaining it. I'm not giving up my sewing because I use secondhand material for that. And that doesn't take any energy from the earth. So the only energy in my sewing is me. So I'm going to stay with that. But everything else, I'm more or less giving up. And I think I want to see how it affects me, you know, like how does it affect my life? And I want to be able to write about that sometime. I'm not sure what this has to do with the pandemic, but the pandemic is, I think, some kind of a warning for human beings to relook at the way we perceive of ourselves in the world today. And I'm saying that not just for North Americans, but for the whole of the rest of the world as well, because a lot of people want to live like us, and that's not a good goal. It's not a good goal. I think water is a big issue. People should have water, should have access to water, but they should also be careful about water and so on. You know, I think everything that we need to survive, we should have, but we should also be careful about what we think we need and what constitutes a really irrational desire. And I think we have to reevaluate all of what we're doing, each and every one of us, everywhere in every corner of the globe, and relook at what's possible. Are we able to live the way that we have been so far? I think we've gone under colonialism from what they say is 500 million people to 7 billion. That's a huge jump in 500 years. If it does that again, that's like way more than the earth can sustain. So that's another issue that we need to consider, is how many there are of us and how we're going to sustain ourselves. That's not 20 minutes, is it? No, it's 19. It's 19. I'm close.
That's good. That's very good. So close. It's probably 19 minutes and 30 seconds, probably.
Yes, 19 minutes. Sure.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we'll move over to Senator St. Clair at this point, please.
I know that, thank you for including me in this conversation. I know that Lee's got somebody there with a big timer in front of her telling her that she's got 19 minutes and 38 seconds, okay? So, let me begin by saying this conversation is very important, and I think we need to have more conversations about this in order for us, to learn about what this is all historically about, traditionally about, as well as what our current means of dealing with it are and should be. And so I appreciate the fact that this is an inaugural event for the series, and I'm honored to be part of it. I encourage you to keep doing this, to keep including the older people, the ones who have knowledge of some of the traditional history and information, so that we can continue to share that. One of the things that I've noted over the years is that there are fewer and fewer resources for young people, young Indigenous people in particular, who want to know the important questions that they have for themselves, which is, how did we deal with these things? What did we used to do? Who are our heroes? Mm-hmm. And so there's lots of conversations around those very many things in our history and in our culture that we need to start sharing with young people, because we're now raising a group of young intellectual people, graduating them from school, who are going on to university, who are becoming our professionals. We now have more teachers, more doctors, more lawyers, more engineers, more architects from Indigenous communities who have Indigenous ancestry, who need to know how to combine their Western education with their traditional knowledge and education as well. And so we need to ensure they get that education. So the reconciliation that we talk about in the TRC report was not simply about the reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It was also about the reconciliation that we need to do within ourselves. Yeah. To come to terms with our identity, to come to terms with what we've come through, and how that has influenced who we are and who we want to be. So let me begin from this perspective, and that is that, as Lee has pointed out, this is not the first time that we have gone through this. As peoples, we have gone through this many times, probably more than we ourselves even know. We know from the records of Western historians about the smallpox epidemics, about the influenza epidemic, about the various diseases that were brought over by the settlers, the colonizers, and what that did to our people. And as an aside on that question, let me say that it's often been said that Indigenous peoples' population were decimated by the fact that diseases amongst Indigenous populations were brought over from settler populations from Europe, and that caused our populations to go down. And I think that argument is wrong for a couple of reasons. A, it ignores totally the issue of genocide. And we know, for example, that when Columbus came over, that his conquistador warriors, soldiers, deliberately set out to exterminate the Indigenous people of Middle America. And I've heard various numbers, but somewhere between 9 million and 90 million people were physically killed, murdered by Spanish soldiers. And that's a huge population of people. And that's a huge impact upon the future of those people as well. So when we talk about reducing population, and we talk about the fact that men, women, and children were physically eliminated, were murdered by this population, we can begin to see that this would have had an impact upon the ability of those populations to grow. And the reason I mention that is because when there is a conversation about the impact of disease upon Indigenous people historically, it's to the exclusion of any discussion around genocide. So it's like they're saying they were weak people. They couldn't resist European people. They didn't have the ability to resist European diseases. Therefore, it was probably okay for them to die because they didn't have the capacity to resist this. They weren't as strong as European people were, and therefore, it's just a sad historical fact, but nobody's fault that they didn't have the resistance. But the reality is that the reduced population was the cause of deliberate acts on the part of European people who came here. And we need to keep that always in mind as we go forward. So I wanted to make that point because there's no question that we did have an ability to deal with diseases, obviously, as a population of people that have been here for 40 to 100,000 or 150,000 years, depending on which archaeologists or anthropologists you talk to. The fact is that during that period of time, we learned how to deal with disease. We learned how to deal with illness. We learned how to heal ourselves. So we had healers, and we had healing practices. There was a study that recently was released on the internet, which talked about the positive impacts of burning sage, for example, and how that cleaned the air, and that cleaned the air of viruses and other diseases that are transmitted through the air. And in this particular disease, coronavirus, we're beginning to see how important it is to protect yourself from what's in the air. And people kind of poo-pooed that initially, saying, well, it doesn't really pass that much. But now, when we see hundreds of thousands of people wearing masks going around the country, we realize that this is serious, that you can catch disease simply by breathing the air. But if you have sage to clean your house, if you have sage, if you have other medicines that will clean the air in your house, then you know that your house is protected, your place is protected. And so we had healing practices that recognized all of that. And we went away from that. We went away from that for lots of reasons, colonization being amongst them. But the fact that we have now stopped believing in our own ways of doing things, I think, is a serious problem. But again, it's beginning to show a revival. We are beginning to see young Indigenous people asking for the opportunity to learn about these things so that they can put it into practice. And I go to events all the time where young Indigenous children, schools in particular, want to have a smudge. They want to have a smudge. They're not quite sure why, but they want to have a smudge. And so in some circles, there was a case in, I think it was British Columbia, where a non-Indigenous woman refused to allow her children to participate in a smudge because she said it was a religious practice. Well, in reality, it wasn't a religious practice. It's a healing practice. It's a cleansing practice. It's like when you go to the Catholic Church and they burn incense in the room. It's helping you. It causes you to focus. So I would say that our knowledge about those things is not at the level where it should be, and we need to get it there. We need to talk to those medicine people within our communities who still have that knowledge in order to ask them, what do we need to do in order to be able to cope with situations like this? So, for example, those communities and Indigenous communities in Canada where there are no reported cases or few reported cases of COVID-19, where there are no deaths reported yet, when you look at what it is that they've been doing, they've largely been communities that have locked everybody else out. And they've said to people, stay indoors, protect yourselves in this way, stop mingling, stop going to large events, and stop leaving the community to go into town. And we'll prevent people from coming from out of the community into the reserve or into our village. And then that way we'll protect ourselves. Blockading the roads to keep non-Indigenous people out of First Nations communities in particular, I think has been very successful in that regard. And we need to understand that that didn't come about simply because some bureaucrat somewhere said that's a good idea. It came about because elders said that's what we used to do. Whenever there was an illness in the community, we would isolate ourselves. We would isolate the people who were ill, and we would isolate ourselves from them, not to shame them, but to simply protect ourselves. And in the same way, if there were illnesses going on in the surrounding villages, we isolated ourselves from those villages and said, those people can't come here and we can't mingle with them until we've seen this resolve itself. And so our traditional teachings, our practices had means by which we could cope with this. And we need to be able to revive those, use them, and make them part of our not only daily practice as individuals, but our collective practice as communities, so that we need laws to reinforce that. We need public knowledge that supports that. And in many ways, we're not at that point yet. A lot of people who are prepared to obey the order of chief and council saying, stay out of town, so to speak, but they're not quite sure why. But I think we need to understand that our healers and our practices are part of the key, not necessarily all of it, because we still need to think about vaccines. We still need to think about overall treatment. We need to think about the epidemic around the world and what it's doing to other people. But for our communities, these are practices that will work for us, and we need to put them into place. Earlier, I mentioned that there were laws, and one of the things as a lawyer and as a judge, I can tell you the hardest and most difficult element of my work as a lawyer and as a judge has always been to convince lawyers and judges that Indigenous people had laws.
Real laws.
It boggles my mind for people to think, well, listen, they've been here 15,000, 25,000, 40,000, 100,000 years, and somehow they managed to get by without laws. Like, how could you even think that? It's incredible, but they do. They honestly believe the racism that they've been taught in public school, that these were heathens, pagans, inferior people who just got by starving. Lucky thing the Europeans came and kept us from starving to death. Or that we were just wandering among the trees picking berries, and that was it. And The reality is that we were organized into societies. Our clan systems were organized in order to help us not only create laws, create relationships, but also to enforce those laws as well. So we had legal systems. We had means by which we can deal with people who refused or could not or did not obey the laws as we had created. And what we did with that. We have teachings around that too. And the refusal of the Canadian legal system to recognize the validity of those laws, to recognize the existence of those laws, is still a matter of some concern. And so we need to understand that that has implications for the ability of a community to effectively deal with its own population and outsiders coming into their communities who may threaten their community because of potential illnesses and spreading the pandemic in amongst their people. And so I think until that happens, we're likely going to see some constant continuing conflict going on. And so I don't have Lee's timekeeper sitting in front of me with the timer on it. So
you got 5 more minutes there, Senator.
I do.
Something to that.
Oh my goodness. If I leave 5 minutes, then Lee's going to talk more, right? But I just wanted to conclude by saying that our elders also talk about the fact that this is a reflection of the nature of the relationship that Canadians, the world, has developed with the rest of creation. That the way in which capitalism, the economy, has treated resources and the disrespect it has shown resources has created the means by which those resources have not been able to protect us. And we need to understand that that has implications, for example, for medicine gatherers and medicine keepers. I know some very good friends who are medicine gatherers, and they say that it is becoming more and more difficult to be able to go out and gather medicines because more and more clear cutting is taking place, or that more and more fences are being built and they're being told to stay out. And
foreign plants.
And as a result, they're limited in their ability to provide those medicines or use those medicines in the healing of people. And they have to go further afield, and that, of course, depends upon financial resources. So I think that in addition to all of that, though, there is the fact that every nation has a creation story. And in the creation story, we were directed, all Indigenous people, as far as I've been able to tell, and I've heard many of their creation stories from the American side as well as the Canadian side, that one of the primary teachings is that we were created last. All of the other beings of creation were created first, and then we were created last. Not to take charge of all of this, but actually to serve all of this and to ensure that it was protected and that we were not here to dominate creation. And I think it's our inability to recognize our role in creation that is helping to contribute to the fact that we do not have the means by which we can solve all of these problems. We now rely upon laboratories to come up with fixes, medical fixes for us, when many of the proper medicines come from natural sources, and we just don't know what those natural sources are. I know many people who work for the scientific labs, the National Research Lab in Winnipeg, who've never, ever gone into the woods to check for medicines. They can't tell you where to find medicines in the woods. They can tell you how to create medicines in the laboratory, but it's artificial, and it's easily developed in that way because they want to be able to sell it and make money off of it. And they haven't learned how to marshal those resources properly. So all of which is to say that it puts us in conflict with European thinking and European historical thinking. And we have not yet resolved that conflict. No.
Yeah. Well, they can't patent anything they don't change. So they take willow bark and create aspirin from it, and it's changed, and they can patent it and sell it. They took our medicine, sold it back to us, different. I have to say, I was in China, and they have this greenhouse. It's 400 feet long by 200 feet wide, and it has thousands and thousands of plants in there. And I asked them why they were showing them to us. He says, well, we thought you might like to know what we got from you. All of their horticultural medicines came from North America. It had died out in China by the time colonialism began here. And they had purchased from 1735 to 1835 thousands and thousands and thousands of medicine plants. And they've done wondrous things with them. And I know Indigenous people that have gone to study there. And we need to relook at what we had before. And we need to rely on that. Before science validates us, we need to do this. We need to have a look at our own systems of managing medicine.
I think that's basically the crux of the difference between a European mindset and an Indigenous mindset that we're talking about in terms of, the way, nature is perceived. And, the fact that, just going back to the idea about the laws that were mentioned earlier, that, you have a people who think that, everything Indigenous is just sort of like always like just sort of lawless and, not really defined and just, that kind of, scenario, just like, hugging trees or something like that. But I think, when we go back to, talking about our different clan systems, our different laws, I mean, the incredible knowledge of medicine. And I was thinking about natural law. And like, how would you define, I guess this is a question for both of you. When we talk about natural law, how do we think about that? And is that something that we need to move forward with in the future?
Okay, I'm Stalo. So we have human law, and we have laws governing our relations to the land, to the water, to the animals, to the birds, to the sky, to the star nations, and to other people. Mm-hmm. We don't have a word for natural in our language. Mm-hmm. You are. That's the word. You are. Yeah, you are a rock. You are a person. You are a dog. I mean, laws are laws. You have laws. But I tend to think that laws come about because somebody did something they shouldn't have. If I whack a tree and destroy it, my ta'a will tell me that's not the way we do things, because it's the wrong thing to do. She has experience that tells her it's the wrong thing to do. So according to my ta'a, it's against the law to break trees. So then I pass that on to my children, and it becomes a law. Mm-hmm. Because we all have this experience that's accumulated. But I don't know of any situation where someone hasn't done something and they conjure a law. That seems to me natural law. Natural law is when the earth comes up with something herself. Mm-hmm. And so we recognize it, that when the clouds gather, it rains. Rain comes from the ocean, and so on and so forth. And this is a natural occurring phenomena that keeps recurring. So we can derive natural law from that by witnessing it. That's kind of how I think of natural law. But go ahead. I think Anishinabes have a different view.
Yeah, we have the right view. Okay. So.
Yeah, there you go. We're stalling.
This is a question actually that is often asked in legal circles, because the young Indigenous lawyers in particular are really curious about traditional law, or sometimes referred to as natural law, and they're not the same thing. So, but I said it all goes back to what your understanding of law is. What is law? And law is the means by which things are ordered. And it's that simple. It's not a complex concept. So it is the means by which things are ordered in the world, and that includes people, but it also includes the beings of creation. It includes natural resources. So water runs downhill. That's a law.
Yeah, there you go. That's a law.
And so we naturally know that, and we can make water go uphill, but it requires us to create something in order to make it do that. And but naturally, it will go in a particular direction. So when we talk about law in that context, then I always say to young Indigenous lawyers who are trying to get their heads around what are our laws and what is natural law, I say natural law is something that man did not create, or that humans did not create. Yeah. So if humans created it, it's not natural law.
Exactly.
If they created it intellectually, it's not natural law. But if you see the way that things are happening, and it constantly and continually happens the same way each time, then that's the way things are ordered. So that means that's the way that creation has ordered it to happen. Therefore, it's a natural law. And we can change that and redirect the water. We can, make things go up that naturally go down. We can make them go left that naturally go right. We can stop the wind. We can create wind. We can do lots of things that are contrary to the way that nature ordered it. But is that the right thing to do? That's a question that we don't ask ourselves, and we need to ask ourselves that. And what are the implications if we do that for other parts of the order of things? And so we often get caught up in saying, well, we need to dam this river because then we can create hydroelectricity from it. And if you dam the river, well, then you're going to back up the water and it's going to flood a little bit of land. But if you flood a little bit of land, then what's it going to do to the trees? And if you kill the trees, then what's it going to do to the birds that live in the trees? And what's it going to do to the animals that rely upon the trees and the brush in order to be able to eat and survive? And what's it going to do to those that rely upon the animals to eat and survive? And what's it going to do to the human beings who rely upon those animals in order to be able to clothe themselves and eat and survive? So it's a cascading impact. And we need to think all of that through. And I am always surprised at the lack of thinking that goes into those kinds of decisions. And even when negative impacts are recognized as happening, they're often poo-pooed and said, well, it'll fix itself. Well, it may not fix itself in a way that we're happy with. That's the thing that
the remedy is happening.
It may, in fact, fix itself in a way that comes back on us and is going to create illness. Muskrat Falls in Labrador, and the way that that river is being flooded and dammed, and the impact that's going to have upon the community, because it's going to release certain things that are in the earth. And there's scientific studies now that corroborate what the traditional people over there have been saying. There are certain elements in the earth that are going to be released into the environment that are going to have a devastating impact upon not just the trees and the animals that are there, but the human beings that live nearby. And are we ready for that? And the reaction by the government is, yeah, but look at the contract. Look how much money we can make from selling this power to, American states. And it sort of gets ignored in that conversation by those people. And I have to say that I am very disappointed at the fact that we constantly put people into positions of power who think that way. And we don't ask ourselves, is this the right person that we want leading us when those kinds of conflicts come about? And so even the way we select our leaders, I think, should call upon us to be more careful about which people we put into positions of leadership in this country.
Exactly.
That's why, you know, our elders are recognized as being not necessarily the ones who govern us, but they are the ones who comment upon the actions that our leaders want to take in order to say, well, that's not quite the right thing to do. You should be doing and thinking about this before you make that call. You know, going to war is an option. Before you do that, have you thought about this? So it causes people to take a pause.
It would be amazing to see, you know, a leader with a mindset or an Indigenous person that is the Prime Minister or the President of the United States, and with a whole other kind of mindset to bring the world, you know, back together. I mean, it feels like this is an opportunity in a way. COVID-19 and the pandemic, it seems like it's a bit of a reflection of our relationship to the earth, which is just so horrible and terrible what we're doing.
Yeah, you would hope so. But let me say that you know, and I've been asked this question about, you know, do we need more Indigenous lawyers, and do we need more Indigenous judges, and do we need more Indigenous senators? And I say, well, we need more Indigenous thinking in those to come. And I said, that's not necessarily what you're going to get when you just appoint an Indigenous person. Because sometimes in order for them to succeed, they have to totally give up all of their Indigenous identity, their indigeneity. They have to really buy into the principle that they have to be what some of our politicians back in the 60s used to say, we got to be faster than the white man. We got to be as good as and better than the white man in order to succeed. And then that's not
still the
correct.
case.
That's not correct. We need to be true to ourselves. We need to be the best human being that we can be, and then see how all of that works out. And the best human being that you can be is one that's consistent with your culture, your sense of self, and your way of living.
Part of the problem, Senator, is that we're getting 12 years of grade school education that's European, and almost no time for an education that's Indigenous. I think that's a big problem. And when we get them to university, they get a more intensive European education. And then we hire them on this question, do you know your culture? And the person says yes, so they can get the job. and then they institute a European style education. And we just seem to be going backward from what I can see. When I was young, a lot of kids knew what was going on in their communities, but now we're not connected to our communities anymore, a lot of us. And a lot of young people that are getting a European education are not getting an Indigenous education. So we need to make sure that universities are enabling us to get an Indigenous education.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that I see happening too is institutions do see that, wow, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous medicine, Indigenous philosophy, Indigenous worldview, values, we want that, but we don't want the Indigenous people.
Well, that's true.
But we don't want the
yeah, let's hire a consultant.
That's what I see happening.
I think John Mohawk said 90% of all medicine in the world is Indigenous, and the Chinese say that too, that it comes from North America. Mm-hmm. Their horticultural medicine comes straight from North America, and they refer to the Anishinabes specifically as the medicine people that they knew about in 1700s. We were shoved out, and then our medicine was appropriated, and then it was bowdlerized, it was changed, and now we have to buy it back. It's like our language. They stopped us from speaking our language, and now we have to go to university and pay them to get it back. Yeah. It's just ridiculous, you know, and of course they don't want us there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you got to be a senator.
Well,
such a bad boy.
I got to tell you, there are many days when I ask myself the same damn question.
I thought they'd shut you up if they made you a senator and it didn't work.
I think that's what they're hoping for.
Probably. I could have told them, no, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do now.
That's why, incidentally, you weren't on my list of references for my job applications.
Yeah.
And you won't be.
Yeah, you put me on there.
We've had so much chat action and from people right across the country, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, Labrador, New Brunswick, Australia, United States, Beckett, Massachusetts, shout out to you. There's just a lot of people on the call. So what we'd like to do is if we'll take a couple of questions. I mean, there's almost 5,000 people on the call, so we won't take 5,000 questions. But maybe what we could do is take a couple of questions, and I'll ask maybe Layla, if you wanted to come in, and maybe if they've been gathering a couple of the questions as we've been on Zoom.
Absolutely.
Sure.
So some of the questions here we have: how do we apply this idea of enclosing in to protect ourselves as urban Indigenous peoples? I am thinking especially of those who may or may not be First Nations and don't necessarily have a land base to retreat to at this time.
Okay, I have family here in Toronto, so it's difficult because my nephew comes to visit me and we have to keep a distance, and we do, and he brings me gifts instead of staying and taking chances with ourselves. During this pandemic, we have to keep apart. My grandson upstairs had a colleague in CAMH that had COVID, and so we couldn't go near him for quite a while, and we had to be careful to shut off the vents to the upstairs and all of this other kinds of stuff that we've been doing. And I think the senator said it's smudging every day because it kills viruses much better than any chemical that you can do, except soap, washing your hands with soap that binds to the virus. But these are difficult times, and I think when we do the right thing, we'll get through it. That's the thing. If the moment you start indiscriminately visiting family and relatives, that's when it starts to spread. And we had that experience during all the flu epidemics, that we cannot gather when illness is happening.
We lost Lee. She froze. Well, let me jump in while we're waiting for her to be reconnected. The quick answer from my perspective is that I don't like anybody, so I tell them all to stay away, and they do it. But it is difficult to maintain distance when you come from a large family. I think that's a very true statement I've heard from many Indigenous people, and our family as well is very caught up in this, and that is that we really like each other. We really like to see each other. We like to enjoy meals together. We like to share times. We like to get together in order to have to watch TV, to watch movies, to talk, to play card games, to do TV bingo, and all those things. So we have large gatherings in our house all the time, and we've had to curtail much of that in order to protect ourselves and protect each other, and that's a difficulty. But the reality is, and you take you take the wisdom from the medical professionals who know what they're talking about and respect it, because in many ways that's also what we used to do traditionally. Earlier on, I talked about the old people that I talked to when this thing first started back in February, March, they would say that in the old days, they used to put people who had an illness that they were concerned that smallpox was the one they talked about the most. When they figured out that somebody had smallpox, they would often put them in their own tepee and keep people away from them. And it was in order to protect that disease from spreading to other people. And there were only a limited number of people, very few people, who could actually go and bring them food and water and make sure they were taken care of. But that they weren't allowed to mingle with other people in the community. So social distancing and isolation were part of our practice and part of our teaching. And in a crowded environment like a city, it's more problematic by virtue of the fact that we're literally living, the width of a wall from the next person. And so you have to be more careful. You have to be more attentive to the limited space that you've got. And going back to the land, for those of us who can do that, is really a benefit. Getting out of the city is a really good thing for people to consider doing. But again, for some people, that's not possible. And so I just think we have to try to make the best of what it is that we are given to deal with. And so I would say follow the guidelines and do what it is that the professionals are suggesting that we do. One of the difficulties that I've been having over the last several weeks, and I think it's true for many people, is that sometimes the advice we're getting from professionals it was inconsistent. So, first of all, we were told not to wear masks, and then they said you should be wearing masks. And then they said, you don't have to be worried about social distancing from your family. And then they said your family is the one you shouldn't be allowing in your house. So I would say that we need to take the advice that we're given, but make our own calls, make our own decisions. But make our own decisions in the best sense that we have to do what we can to protect ourselves, to ensure that we don't become ill and that we don't spread the illness.
Well, my aunt was visited by a relative and she's dead now. And so we have to be careful of our elders. That's the one thing. She's 80, she was 82. She might not have lived much longer, doesn't matter. The thing is that somebody wasn't careful with her. And I think my nephews and my kids are really, my grandkids are really, really careful about me. They don't go out and about in the world and come back and visit me and come close. I just think we should be careful about our elders.
Mm-hmm. I have another question here. If part of the problem is the Eurocentric education system, how do we shift that to make room for authentic Indigenous education? What would an Indigenous education look like? And how do we create more Indigenous thinking, as Senator Sinclair has suggested?
Well, I think that the gathering of elders, Europe had 500 years to develop the curriculum that it has, and we haven't had 2. So let's take some time, let's put some money into it, and let's get our elders together to develop the curriculum. What is it going to look like? What is our thinking? I think there's probably about 100 Siams in the Salish nation. If you gathered them together, you could find how to create Salish thinking.
One of the things I get asked that question a lot, because one of the bylines, I guess we can call it that, or the slogans that came out of the TRC report was that education is the key to reconciliation. Yes. And we said that then because we believed it, and we believe it now. And we weren't just talking about the education of Indigenous people. We were also talking about the education of non-Indigenous people, because not only was the culture taken away from Indigenous people and they were forced to become assimilated, but the ability of non-Indigenous people to learn about Indigenous people was also denied to them in the public school system, as well as, of course, what went on in the residential schools. And we need to recognize that all of that was based not only upon fallacy and myth, but upon racism, and we need to change that. So, changing the way that public school delivers education generally is key. But my view about if we were to establish, if I were in charge of a school and they said to me, let's figure out what's the best way of creating a good school system for our young Indigenous children, I would say I would bring in grandmothers. Every teacher would be a grandmother, or every grandmother would be a teacher, and they would be the ones that would be the ones responsible for teaching the children. You can have somebody who delivers the educational curriculum that the province requires. So teaching them how to add, teaching them how to write, teaching them the historical information that is contained in the curriculum. That can be delivered by a teacher's aide, someone with a teaching degree. But we place too much emphasis upon those who have teaching degrees from universities and not enough emphasis upon our true teachers, and those are our mothers. Our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunties. My wife and I, when we had our children, we wanted our children to learn the language. And so what we did was we established an immersion nursery school program in which all of the teachers were grandmothers, because our teaching is that the first teacher that every child has is the mother and the grandmother and the aunties. And therefore, we said, if that's our teaching, then let's implement that. And so we brought in grandmothers who only talked to the children in Anishinabe. And all of those children learned to speak Anishinabe because not only were they given the language, but they were given the love that they needed from those grandmothers and those mothers. And the mothers also, many of whom couldn't speak the language, they also came with their children. And they learned to speak the language. And they also learned how to be better parents from those grandmothers. And so it was a full learning experience. So I would say if I were going to establish an Indigenous-based education system, I would ensure that there were grandmothers in every classroom that had full charge, that they were in charge.
Okay. One person has asked with regards to the conversation about law and natural law, is COVID-19 expressing a law or an expression of law?
I think it's a runaway virus. That's what it is. If you pay attention to the corruption and the pandemic, the woman who was working on this when it got away tells us that it takes 800 years to really naturally mutate to the level that it has. So the mutation is induced by scientists. That's the problem. And then it got away. We don't know how it got away. You know, she thinks it was deliberate. I don't know how it got away, but it did get away. It originates from the common cold virus originally, and then they started mutating it, and eventually it got away on them. So it's not a natural response to anything.
I would disagree, and I do that only because I'm socially distanced from Lee. Okay. Otherwise,
no, I'm not saying this is my opinion. This is the opinion of the woman who worked in the lab.
All right.
You wrote a book on it. You disagree with her.
All right, I disagree with her. My perspective is that this is a reflection of how nature takes care of things, yes, and how nature, in fact, makes those things flourish, good and bad. And so natural law would say that if there is an environment in which a disease can grow and become strong, then that disease will grow and become strong. And so we have that kind of an environment right now. And we've created that environment amongst ourselves. But it's just a medical condition that is filling a gap that has been created by us. And so I would say it's a reflection of what would naturally occur in the order of things. But in the same way, there is a natural remedy for all of this too. And the question is, what is that remedy? How do we handle this? How do we keep this from becoming worse? So, I think Lee's frozen again.
Thank you.
Oh dear, yes. Well, I'll share another question in the meantime while Lee comes back. How can we share more Indigenous thinking and healing natural medicine in the westernized world?
How can we share? Well, first of all, I think the school system has an obligation to make those opportunities available. I think to the extent that Indigenous people control those schools that they control, whether it's in First Nations communities or Métis communities or Inuit communities, if you are in control of the schools that are educating your children, you should ensure that the schools are reflective of the thinking that you want your children to have as they grow up. So what is it that you need to do in order to ensure that they are able to succeed in life, both professionally and with whatever training they might need in order to fill the needs of society. But at the same time, that will make them strong human beings, strong people who are consistent with those roles that people play in society. So we need to ensure that our schools are given that responsibility in the same way that before we had a public school system, that all families ensured that their children were properly educated to understand about family, understand about their family's history, understand about their own culture, their own community's history, their own history going back to the beginning of time, to their own creation story, but also about their responsibility to the future. And so public schools and public education system, I think, have that responsibility, and that we have to ensure that that happens. I don't know if that answers the question. Is there something else in the question that I might have missed?
Layla, are you there?
I am. So we have another question here. We are seeing a lot of anxiety, fear, and hopelessness, especially in our youth. How can we help teach them and support them so that they can know in their hearts that we have been through this before?
Oh, that's where I think our traditional wisdom keepers are really important. I think they need to hear from the leaders of their communities. They need to be reassured by the leaders of the communities that we will get through this, or we have gotten through this before and we will get through this now. So I wouldn't be reliant upon what it is that they're seeing on TV or others. I would try to provide them with opportunities to hear and share information from the people in their families, the people in their communities, the elders from whom they receive information or for whom they have respect, and let them gain their information and their sense of comfort that way. And we need to ensure that they don't despair. We don't want them to despair.
Hello.
Okay, there, Lee.
You're echoing, Lee.
I think Senator Sinclair is doing this to me on purpose.
Kalumpa is my conspirator on this. Okay.
I
saw that, Kalumpa. Thank you.
Lee, I can repeat the last question for you now that you've joined again to see if you'd like to answer that as well. Okay. Someone has asked, we are seeing a lot of anxiety, fear, and hopelessness, especially in our youth. How can we help teach them and support them so that they can know in their hearts that we have been through this before?
Okay, there's a whole lot of things going on with the youth that don't have anything to do with this current crisis. The crisis just adds to it. And so I think part of it is dealing with the other things that go with it. We need to seriously get a hold of parenting skills that are better. I know that. 60% of our youth are being abused in some way or other, either at school or in their communities or in the neighborhoods and so on. And they're not getting a lot of support from us. I don't think we're raising them in a community-minded way, the way that they were intended to be raised, with the love of community. And I know this from being all over the country and talking to youth everywhere. So that is the earlier bunch of issues that residential school created that are still there, and we haven't resolved them. And now we've got this crisis on our hands, and we have to deal with the crisis. And of course, the youth don't have any more anxieties, at least not in my communities, than they had before. But they have this additional crisis that they don't know how to deal with because they haven't been brought up in communities that are culturally healthy. So we have to create culturally healthy communities, and I don't think this country is committed to that. I don't think they've committed to the recommendations by the RTC, the Truth and Reconciliation, is that it? No, TRC, sorry, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Until that happens, we don't have a way to deal with the anxieties and the troubles of youth. We need to be back to ourselves as healthy, culturally thriving communities. That's what we need. And I know, Sinclair, you know very well that the recommendations of the TRC are not being picked up in a hell of a hurry by the government.
That's absolutely true. And let me add one thing to my earlier comment as well, and it is this. If we want to take advantage of the opportunity that's now available to us to provide reassurance and keep the hopes of our young people up, I think we need to ask ourselves, what is it that, what are they paying attention to? What is it that has an impact for them? And I would say that we should be looking at using webcasts. We should be looking at using the internet. We should be looking at giving them access to musicians, access to people in the media, so that they, when they have questions, that they have a place that they can go and ask them.
Yes.
I know that the young parents out there themselves are looking for resources they can provide for their children, and I would offer up whatever time I have in order to be able to do that, because there are many people out there who are always saying, "What can I do to help?" And I say to them, find a young child or a couple of children, whether they're in your family or outside of your family, and just check in on them and ask them how you doing, because that's important. They need to know that somebody cares. Yes,
absolutely.
One of the things that, as we're saying, we're talking about, the pandemic in a way that it kind of it shines a light on, things that are in crises, or it just, exacerbates everything that's already been there. Like you were saying, Lee, like the treatment of youth in this country, the treatment of elders, the treatment of elders in senior housing and senior homes at this time. Our domestic abuse is up. Alcoholism is up and everything. And this is worldwide. This is not just within our Indigenous community. And, I was thinking about, so much goes back to, because in this time I've been sort of looking at, food really differently, and everything that I've been cooking more than I ever have and all that kind of stuff. And I was just thinking, yes, food is medicine. It is medicine. Yeah. And then I was thinking, if our diets, if we started with our diets in a way and went back to our medicine, thinking of food as medicine and the way we think about food as medicine, as opposed to this, but it's beauty, it's simplicity, and all of its good vitamins and all that, but just even how, just seeing it in a very different way. And I think if our diets were there was a return, or looking at what our diets are as Indigenous peoples, I think what would roll out really differently from there is a different emotional way, a different thinking intellectual way, a different spiritual way, because food is medicine.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think it's simple for me, Sandra. My kids were 3 and they said, I don't like that. I said, good. And I took it away and I didn't give them anything.
Mm-hmm.
My mother did the same thing to me. And her mother did the same thing to her. You don't get to pick what you eat. The adults do. Because the adults know it's medicine. And if we feed our kids what they like, they're only going to want candy and cake and cookies and sugar and all kinds of other alcohol-inducing stuff in 3-year-olds. We got a bunch of drunk kids. That's what we got. And that's because we fed them what they want to eat instead of what they need to eat. So we need to look at, as adults, look at medicine and food as the same thing, and sugar things as the opposite of medicine. It's poison. The women in Barcelona, Spain, demonstrated against it in 1490. It was the first demonstration in the world. Sugar is a poison, and it supports slavery. So that's how this whole business of colonialism started. It poisoned everybody with sugar from all over the world. And now we have a bunch of kids that are raised on sugar, and it turns to alcohol in their intestine. 3 years old. We have to stop that. We have to start treating food as medicine, and we have to insist that we medicate our children appropriately. Mm-hmm. And then raise them with the notion that we need to be human. We don't need to have sweet things. We need to be sweet.
Any comments, Senator Sinclair?
Yeah, you're stopping me from eating this butter tart that's sitting on my desk. That's not true, okay? I know that I have family watching this thing, and I want them to know I do not have a butter tart on my desk, because they're monitoring carefully what I eat while I'm in this socially difficult way. But we do need to be
Somebody
more
wrote
supportive. All right, we do need to be more supportive of parents. We do need to be more helping to parents, because the history of our relationship with society over the last 100 and 150 years or longer even has been one in which the role of parents has been decimated within our communities, starting with the residential schools, but also now with the child welfare system. They literally steal our children out of the hospital before we can even take them home. And so as a result, we have many young parents, many parents who are getting their children returned to them who don't know yet how to parent fully. And I was going to say properly, but that's not the right word. They have an instinct about parenting, but they don't know how to do it fully because they don't have access to the resources. They don't have a grandmother in the picture. They don't have an auntie in the picture that can help them with the big questions that they have. I know many young mothers who talk about the fact, when we were doing the TRC, talked about the fact that they were only able to manage with the day-to-day challenges of their existence as a mother because they had an auntie that they could call, that they could turn to when they had a question that they couldn't answer. And many mothers, in fact, have access to a resource like that, but it's a reduced number of people for us. But we also need to understand, I think, that we can't overstate the problem, and I don't want us to be over generalizing here. The vast majority of young Indigenous people are trying to cope as best they can in this day and age, and they still are not getting the kind of information that they need to get. So they don't know that this is not new to us. They don't know that we have teachings around this. They don't know that we have healers who can help with this. They don't know that we have laws, that we had laws, that we have laws. They're still living in an environment of ignorance that the public school system that they attend perpetuates. And there are lots of teachers who are trying to change that, but they're not getting the support from the school boards and from the public school system that they need in order to be able to do it effectively. So I think Lee is frozen again.
Either that or she's a long smile.
She'll be coming back to join us imminently, but maybe I'll pose one more question here. Someone actually has recently asked what your thoughts are on mandatory vaccines as relates with the coronavirus. If the government decides to impose one, this person says they had read an article recently by a constitutional lawyer who says that our Supreme Court of Canada determined that no one can be forced to take any medical treatment without informed consent. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose the answer to that is if they're informed what the impact is going to be and still refuse to do it, then I guess the courts are saying that they could still force you to take the treatment. I think the question is whether you can deny your consent to a form of treatment that is intended to not only keep you alive, but keep you from spreading a disease. And it doesn't surprise me to learn that I think historically there have been instances in the past in which people have been dealt with harshly who have refused to participate in a mandatory isolation system, who have refused to participate in a mandatory vaccination system because their continued presence could have resulted or did result in other people getting the disease. I know when I went to school in the 50s, polio vaccination was mandatory for all kids in the school system. I suppose the answer could have been you could have pulled your kid out of the school system, but then they wouldn't have gotten an education. And there are other diseases as well where we were mandatorily told that in order to attend the school, we had to be vaccinated in a particular way. When you leave the country and when you go to a particular part of the world, they tell you they won't let you into the country unless you have proof that you've been vaccinated in a particular way, either when you go into the country or when you leave the country. So I think mandatory vaccination is probably part of the overall possible evolution of this. But at this point in time, there is nothing to suggest to me that vaccination is going to be the be-all and end-all of this. I think the real question is, what is it that we are doing? What has been the cause of this, and can we address the cause of this properly so that we don't have to resort to mandatory vaccination?
I'm going to interject here with a question, and perhaps we'll leave on this question, and I'll just say a few final things at the end. Is I guess it goes back to hope, and what is the hope. So many people are looking for hope in this time, and I just had a question, and maybe this is because I have a philosophical bent of mind, and I'm just really interested in how you would define wisdom from an Indigenous perspective.
Oh, well, you're asking the wrong dude here. Because, I come from I live in an environment in which I go to work in the Senate every day, and when I'm there, people are constantly telling me what a wise and smart person I am, and then I come home and my wife tells me that I'm not even equivalent to the dogs in terms of where I fit in. So I would I would say that defining wisdom it's a moving target all the time for me. The key, I think, is that it's the ability of people to understand a very important principle, and that is that we don't have the the right or the obligation to tell people what to do, that we have the obligation to respond to what people ask of us. And when people ask us a question, we have the obligation to be truthful in the way that we respond to it. And so it is those people who understand what it is that's being asked of them and how it is that they can respond in a kind, gentle, and respectful way that really, I think, defines what it means to be a wise person. I don't know. I don't know that it's only about knowledge. I think it's been my experience that when people come to me and ask me a question, that it's often that they just want to be reassured that they're doing the right thing, or they're going in the right way, or they want to feel that they have your support, or that they know that it's going to be difficult, and they just want to have a moment's pause with somebody that they like to help them feel good about their decision. And so I don't always, when some people have left a conversation with me, they've often said, well, you didn't really tell me what to do, but now I know what I'm going to do. So I say, well, that's good. That's really what it's important, is that you're able to feel confident about the direction that you're taking. So I don't know. I think it's a process more than anything else. I don't really think there's any singular answer to it. You could come up with all sorts of definitions of what is wisdom, I guess. But
Really like
it's like I was I was asked one time, what is an elder? And I said, well, there's all sorts of working definitions of elders. People who have traditional knowledge and traditional ceremonial knowledge and traditional teachings versus people who are just simply old. But I said, to me, when you look around the room and you find out that you're the oldest person there, well, you're automatically an elder. So you've got no choice to accept that responsibility. And what is that responsibility? If you don't know what the responsibility is that goes with that position, then you shouldn't be claiming that status. You shouldn't be trying to pretend. And the ones who I really have a great deal of respect for are the ones who I believe are elders, who are saying constantly, I'm not an elder. I'm just here to help you in whatever way you want me to help. So.
Yeah, great. Language. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we might have lost Lee a little bit in the process there. So your tactics are working.
Maybe she gave up on us. I know she was working off her iPhone, and sometimes those are iffy. So
yeah. One question that people have is about resources, and I can just let everybody know that in terms of resources, and I mean in terms of like podcasts and films and documentaries and historical and books on law and poems and plays, we are going to be putting up an incredibly extensive resource list up on our website, and it'll probably be up in about 2 weeks. So please come back to redskyperformance.com and you will see a real, one of the most comprehensive lists that I have seen out there. So there's that you can look into. I also just want to say that we are going to be doing another Wisdom Keeper series on June 21st, which will be International People's Day, which I don't know why we just get a day. I don't understand that.
Indigenous People's Day.
Yeah.
You said international. Indigenous.
Oh, Indigenous. I don't know why we just get the day. I think I keep calling it month or week, not more than a day for sure. And also just to let people know that we do have some programming for children of a piece that is a beautiful piece that is for children between the ages of 5 to 12 called Mistatim. And it has dance and theater and music and song. And it's basically a story of reconciliation written for children so that they can start talking about that very, very young. But it's all told through this so-called taming of a wild horse named Mistatim. And so that's on June 19th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I also want to thank Canadian Heritage, I know, who's also on this call as well, and just to give a shout out to them for supporting our series in what we do at Red Sky Performance. And a big thank you to you, Senator Sinclair, for being with us today. And I'm always just really interested in what you have to say. And you're so playful and wise and fun and thoughtful. And I just really enjoy your presence, albeit virtual at this time. So thank you very much to you.
Well, thank you for that.
Yes, and thank you to Lee Maracle as well. Big shout out to her as well. We will also have her books listed on that resource list if you're interested in reading Lee's work. She's a phenomenal writer. And we want you to thank all the attendees. I can see like Hawaii's come up and, you know, other places all around the world, which is very exciting. And to 5,000 people, thank you for joining us. And please come back for one of our other talks in the future. And, you know, you can go to our Facebook page, Red Sky Performance, or to Twitter or Insta, which is Red Sky Connect. And we really want to thank you for taking the time for being with us today and for being so interested in Indigenous culture and Indigenous thought and Indigenous worldview. Yes, and everybody please stay safe and be healthy. And thank you so much. And Chimigwech for joining everybody. We will
Be strong, everybody. Miigwech.
Any last words, Senator Sinclair? We're going to end with you.
Well, I would say just to pick up on the message at the end that it is important that people be strong at this point in time and understand that we will get through this. I have no doubt of that. We will get through this. We will survive as we always have, and we will be able to learn from this. And as we're going forward now, ask yourselves the question, what would we do differently again if this were to happen once more? And let's change the way that we react to these things. Particularly from an Indigenous perspective. I think being more inclusive of Indigenous perspectives and how we respond to this is really key for our communities and our people and our youth in particular. They need to know that we can fix ourselves too. Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rich, thank you, everyone.